Hey, welcome back to the channel. I've got some really good tips for you guys today on how to be very productive and efficient and produce a really quality install on a tongue and groove nickel gap, aka shiplap installation. Just got done installing almost 2 linear miles of this stuff on this house. I'm going to give you some of the tips that I use to help me make money, be productive, and produce a really quality result. Tip number 1, use a Festool HKC Tracksaw or Mafel, pick your poison, whatever it is, but these guys are absolute money makers on installs like this. I mean, not even funny how many times this saw has paid for itself many times over. For me, gives you the ability to batch cut at your pile of product versus having to carry all that product to your miter saw, set it on the miter saw and cut it. So huge advantage having one of these guys. I use a combination of the HKC and the miter saw at times. The other key thing on small pieces, I do like the miter saw and stop block combination whenever I'm doing a bunch of repetitious smaller pieces, but the bulk of my cutting happens at the pile with an HKC Tracksaw. I may do a separate video in the future showing how I batch cut with that. It's a really cool system that I use and it's extremely productive. Tip number 2, and this is huge. I learned this really quick as soon as I started trimming houses. How do you scribe that last piece of shiplap or whatever it is, nickel gap, whenever it's tongue and groove? How do you get that perfect scribe on that thing? And the answer is, whenever you're on your second to last piece, put that second to last piece up there and then use an offset block that is the same width of your product. So in this case, on this job, I'm installing a 5-inch nickel gap. So what I do is I just cut a 5-inch block, and when I put that second to last piece up on the wall, I can just run this block with my pencil down that wall and it marks that piece with a perfect offset, and then I've got a perfect scribe. That might not make sense until you see it in action, but I'm telling you, you've got to learn that trick if you don't know it already. It is the best way to get perfect scribes whenever you're using a shiplap or a tongue and groove nickel gap product. Okay, tip number 3, this is another really important tip. Layout is really important, and sometimes to get everything perfectly centered in a room that's especially a long room, you want to start in the middle and work out. Now with a tongue and groove product, in order to do that, you're going to need to use a spline. So what I do is I take an offcut from scrap piece and I rip a spline out of the same material. That way it's pre-primed and everything. So then you can start in the center of your room and put your spline in the groove, and then you can work from the center of your room in both directions and you'll have a tongue on both sides. That way you're going to end up with the same width of a piece on both sides as you finish up. Now you might be thinking, well, why wouldn't I just do the math and start on one end? That way I only have to scribe one piece, or it's just easier to start on one end, whatever. Well, here's the tricky thing about these tongue and groove products. Even though this is a 5-inch nickel gap, and I should be able to just figure everything based off of that 5-inch number, oftentimes what happens is there's a subtle difference in width, and it will either shrink, or 99% of the time your width will actually grow as you go down the room. So let's say on a 60-inch stretch, I've found that this product will grow about 3/16 or 1/4 inch. So rather than ending up on that exact 5-inch mark, which would be 60 inches, I have like 60 1/4. So if I start on one end of the room, it's just easy to end up with pieces that aren't exactly the same. And sometimes it's really critical to have the exact same measurements. In this cathedral ceiling with vertical nickel gap, I ended up with almost an exact full piece on both sides. So it was really important to start in the center of the room here. You'll notice on this long hallway, I've got light fixtures at exactly the center of the hall. Did the same thing here, started in the center and worked out using a spline. Same thing here in this basement area. Started in the center and worked out both ways. Tip number 4, optimize your waste. So in this house, I had tons of nickel gap details. I got here and I wasn't expecting to have so much of the nickel gap delivered. There's a huge amount of weight on the floor. So the first thing I did was I busted out the HKC Tracksaw and just started slicing and dicing. And as I was doing that, I was cutting material and putting it in respective openings, but then trying to find what lengths worked so I could optimize the full pieces and not have any waste. I'm super proud on this job. With the thousands and thousands of feet that I installed, we had almost no waste. Even having walls that were often 10 feet pieces, was still able to use up those offcuts in other areas, so we weren't wasting money throwing product in the dumpster. So to do that, many of you know this already, you obviously want to start with your odd pieces. So your 10-foot, 11-foot pieces that are going to give you an odd length of offcut. I was then able to use those offcuts that might have been 7 foot long or whatever strategically in different places. As you can see behind me here, even on this wall, I've got built-ins going in. I didn't run the shiplap or the nickel gap all the way to the ground because the cabinet is going to cover that up, or in other areas, vanities, we're going to cover that up. So I was able to use those pieces there. I'll show you another room over here. This is a room I was able to optimize my offcuts really well. I had a bunch of 80-inch pieces that I was able to use on the face of the fireplace. And then on this cathedral ceiling, we've got beams going in here. So we're able to use short pieces and splice them at the center of the beams because they'll be covered up. So really didn't have any waste on this job after it was all said and done. Tip number 5, I got asked this a lot as I went through this process via direct message on Instagram. Should you use adhesive on the back side of your nickel gap or shiplap product? To me, the answer is if it's a tongue and groove nickel gap and you've got framing going perpendicular to your installation, then the answer is no. You do not need adhesive because it is interlocked with the tongue and groove and you've got framing. In the situations where I had vertical shiplap, yes, I'll use PL Premium there because I can't hit framing on every piece and I want to fasten that to the drywall. If you're using a shiplap product like this, which is going to be installed and has to be face nailed on the front, I would recommend using adhesive on the back of that to ensure that that piece never pops loose on the face and causes any issues. I have heard of that happening a lot. So use the proper size nails if you have to face nail. Shiplap and adhesive is certainly a good thing to use there. Tip number 6, if you're cutting a bunch of MDF, use your junk blades. Part of the reason I got all of my shiplap installation done on this job before I moved on to anything else is simply because I didn't want to have to keep switching back and forth between my good blades and my junk blades. MDF dulls blades really quickly and you get a huge amount of pitch buildup. From the guys who do a lot of MDF work, I've gathered that it's really crucial to constantly be cleaning your blades when you're using MDF. For me, I basically only install MDF when I'm doing this nickel gap product. That's the only time I use MDF for the most part. But you can see here, I've got a junk Freud blade on there, works just fine for MDF. Same thing on the table saw. But now that I'm done with this installation, I'll take those blades off, put my good blades back on, and we're good to go. One other small tip, a lot of times I trim houses and I'll just have a very small amount of this nickel gap to install, maybe 1 or 2 accent walls. And whenever I have that, I often like to just use my HKC Tracksaw for that. That way I've just got the junk blade on it and I'm not having to change blade on my miter saw or anything like that. Tip number 7, use dust collection. Again, cut a ton of this MDF nickel gap here. Many of you guys know this is a new tool for me. It is the Fast Cap Chop Shop sawdust hood, but I don't know why I waited so long to get this thing. It was absolutely amazing. As you see here, I'm set up with a staircase open behind me. Before, if I would have been doing all this cutting without a vac and without this hood, it would have sprayed that MDF dust all over everything. It would have been a disaster in here. I'm super impressed with how well this dust hood contains everything. One concern I had was that with buying it, it would just end up pushing all this dust back at my face. I really find it doesn't do that. It goes in and kind of just settles down. With the MDF, running the vac was huge. I could tell it made a world of difference. That sawdust is so fine, and even though the DeWalt saws aren't great for dust collection, just having that airflow to pull everything back made a huge difference. I dumped my bag multiple times with MDF sawdust, so I know that it was making a huge difference as I was cutting this stuff. Same thing with the table saw. I often just use a dust bag on the table saw, but here I brought my CT26 for the MDF because I cut all of my scribes on the end at a bevel on the table saw. Best way for me to make those scribe cuts. So tons of cutting happened here. Again, you can see I still ended up with dust everywhere, but again, I dumped my bag multiple times. So that was huge, having dust collection on the table saw also. Lastly, I did a lot of cutting at the pile with this HKC saw, and it actually does a really good job as well as dust collection. It really throws most of that MDF dust into the bag, and as long as you empty it every once in a while, it does a pretty good job and you don't end up with sawdust everywhere with this saw as well. Tip number 8, I hate to do this as a production carpenter, but it's so much easier to do it beforehand, and that is sand the product before installation. The primer job is just not good enough on this for a high-end home. It's got to be sanded, and I can do it way more effectively with a power sander than the painter's going to do it trying to hand sand it after I install it. So I take the time to do that. I don't love doing it, but I've just come to accept that it's necessary on this pre-prime product because it's got so many stinking blotches and snipe marks and drips of primer and everything all over it. Scratches from transit, it's just got to be sanded. So it sucks, but do the right thing and sand it before you install it, and you'll get a way better result after the painter gets after it. Tip number 9, what you see behind me are trim racks inside the house. We are in June right now. The humidity is off the charts. Air conditioning is turned on. Fans are going in the basement. Dehumidifier is on. Acclimate your product in the house before installation. This is huge with this MDF. It is the most common misconception in carpentry that I come across. People think that MDF is stable. That is a joke. It's more stable when compared to wood on the width, yes, but at the length, MDF moves way more than real wood at its length. So if you're installing these 16-foot pieces of MDF and you've had them laying on the garage floor, And then next winter, the air dries out, that crap is gonna shrink more than you would believe. And I have seen disasters with this product. I have this MDF exact same nickel gap product installed in my own house, and I watch it move inside my own home every year, which is regulated pretty well. MDF moves a lot at length. That's why we don't use it in the Midwest for things like crown molding and baseboard, because at length there's too much movement, those joints will open up. But especially if you've got this stuff sitting on a garage floor, you are screwed. It is gonna shrink like crazy and you're gonna have big problems. I've seen other trimmers install this in high-end homes without acclimating it correctly, and it's crazy the disasters that I've seen. So make sure you acclimate the product before you install it. Okay, last tip, tip number 10, then I promise I'm done. Couple tips on tools. One of the mistakes that I see guys make a lot whenever they're installing this product with this tongue and groove nickel gap is you put the piece on and then you want to kind of hammer it down. A lot of guys reach for their steel hammer and they hit that. Well, that puts big dents in that tongue, and then you go to put your next piece on top and it will not go together, because on the back side here you just put a dent on that fragile MDF. So what makes an absolute world of difference is to use a rubber mallet, use the red tip here. It's soft, and I'm telling you, you wouldn't think so, but it makes all the difference in the world. You can hit this stuff and hammer it down nice and tight and it won't damage your tongue, and then your next piece will go on nice and easy. Trust me, it doesn't take anything at all as far as tapping with these steel hammers, and it destroys that tongue and makes it really hard to get that next piece on. Also, as far as nailers go, I like to use air nailers a lot just so it doesn't destroy my arm. For the 2 miles of shiplap that I just installed, I used my cordless almost the whole time because it was just so much more convenient not having a hose. The nice thing about this nailer is it's got that, I don't know what you'd call it, direct contact tip, and it's a lot easier to get into that tight little area where that groove is. I don't know if you can see that. You have a pretty small area to get in, and with this nailer, it's a lot easier to put a nail right there. Whereas if you're trying to use what is my typical nailer with that big tip, I can still do it, but it's just not as easy. Another question I got a couple times this week was, what size nails do I use and what length? I like to use 15 gauge nails. I just like the holding power a lot better. And as far as length, you just gotta be careful that you're not over penetrating into the wall where you might potentially hit water lines. So if I'm doing a cathedral ceiling, I like to use the 2.5 inch nails because I know there's not gonna be water lines up there, and I want that extra holding power simply because it's hanging up on a ceiling. But whenever I get to, say, like a wall in a bathroom behind a vanity, I'm gonna drop down to 2 inch nails because I want more minimal penetration just in case there's a water line in that area. And of course, you guys know I mark water lines on the floor in blue, but that still doesn't tell me exactly where they're at. So if there's any question, I don't want to be putting a bunch of nails into water lines. I'll drop my nail length down a little bit and sacrifice a little bit to prevent any major issues down the road. So like I said, guys, just got done installing a couple miles of this stuff and wanted to make some content around it. Hopefully you found it helpful. If you've got any questions, let me know below. I know that the nickel gap and shiplap craze gets a lot of hate in the comment section amongst carpenters because it's trendy or whatever. Personally, I'll take this installation all day long. Requires no brain power. It's easy money. It's easy to create margin on a big install like this using production techniques to help increase those profit margins. So Hopefully you guys have found the video helpful. Drop a comment below, hit that like button, and if you want to support the channel, check out my Amazon storefront, and there's always affiliate links to the tools that I use in the notes below. When you use those links to purchase tools, it helps me out a ton, and I appreciate it. So we'll see you on the next video, and thanks for watching.